was a stormy night when Jennifer first laid eyes on Blackwater Manor, an imposing Victorian house that loomed over the edge of a remote cliff. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain lashed against the car windows as she approached the estate. For years, the house had been abandoned, yet the townsfolk spoke of it in hushed tones, sharing chilling stories of those who had gone inside and never returned. Jennifer, a writer with a penchant for the macabre, had come seeking inspiration for her next novel. Blackwater Manor, with its dark history and eerie reputation, seemed like the perfect place. She had rented the house for the weekend, determined to immerse herself in its haunting atmosphere. As she pulled up the long, winding driveway, her stomach churned with a mix of excitement and fear. The front of the house was grand but decaying. Vines crept up the stone walls, and the windows were dark and lifeless. The wooden door creaked open with a soft push, and Jennifer stepped inside, instantly greeted by the cold, musty air. Her footsteps echoed through the grand foyer, where a massive chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling. The walls were lined with portraits of grim-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her as she walked. The floorboards creaked beneath her as she made her way through the house. It was eerily quiet, save for the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. Jennifer explored room after room, taking in the old furniture, the dusty chandeliers, and the peeling wallpaper. It felt as though time had stopped in this place. In the grand living room, a large, ornate mirror caught her attention. It was covered in dust, but something about it seemed off. As she wiped away the dirt with her sleeve, her reflection stared back at her, only it wasn't quite right. Her face looked distorted, as though the mirror was bending her image. She shook it off, blaming the old glass, but a chill ran down her spine as she turned away. Jennifer settled into the study, lighting a fire in the hearth and setting up her laptop on an antique desk. She was determined to start writing immediately, drawing from the house's dark energy. Hours passed as she typed away, but the deeper she delved into her story, the more unsettled she became. She kept hearing faint noises, footsteps, whispers, and the sound of something scraping against the walls. Every time she paused to listen, the sounds would stop, leaving only the crackling of the fire. It was nearly midnight when Jennifer decided to take a break. She stood, stretching her stiff muscles, and walked to the kitchen to make some tea. As she passed by the grand mirror again, she froze. Her reflection wasn't there. Instead, she saw the faint outline of a figure standing behind her, just barely visible in the dim light. She spun around, heart pounding, but the hallway was empty. Her breath quickened as she backed away from the mirror, convinced that her mind was playing tricks on her. But she spun around, heart pounding, but the hallway was empty. Her breath quickened as she backed away from the mirror, convinced that her mind was playing tricks on her. But as she retreated, the figure in the mirror seemed to grow clearer. A tall, shadowy man with hollow eyes that stared back at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The power flickered, plunging the house into darkness. Jennifer's heart raced as she fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to navigate her way back to the study. The fire had died down, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. She grabbed a candle from the mantel and lit it, the small flame flickering weakly in the cold air. Just as she was about to return to her writing, she heard it again, the scraping sound. It was louder now, coming from the hallway just outside the study. Her pulse quickened as she slowly opened the door, holding the candle out in front of her. The hallway was empty, but the sound persisted, now coming from upstairs. It sounded like something, or someone, was dragging a heavy object across the floor. Jennifer hesitated, but her curiosity got the better of her. She crept up the grand staircase, her footsteps barely audible over the sound of the scraping. As she reached the top, she noticed that one of the doors at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar. The sound was coming from inside. With trembling hands, Jennifer pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, save for the pale moonlight filtering in through the window. In the center of the room stood an old rocking chair, its back to her. It was moving slowly, creaking as it rocked back and forth, though no one was sitting in it. Jennifer's breath caught in her throat as she took a step closer. The chair stopped abruptly, and the room fell silent. She was about to turn and leave when she saw it, a figure standing in the corner of the room, half hidden in the shadows. It was the same man from the mirror, his hollow eyes now fixed on her. He was tall and gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tightly over his bones. His lips twisted into a sinister smile as he took a step forward. Jennifer stumbled back, her candle flickering wildly as the figure moved closer. She turned and fled down the hallway, her footsteps echoing loudly in the empty house. Behind her, she could hear the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, following her. She reached the study, slamming the door behind her and locking it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pressed her back against the door, trying to catch her breath. The house had grown unnervingly quiet once again. For a moment she thought she had escaped, until she heard the soft creak of the rocking chair in the corner of the study. Slowly she turned her head, dread pooling in her stomach. There, in the corner of the room, the rocking chair moved on its own, back and forth, as if something invisible was sitting in it. And then the whispers started, faint at first, but growing louder. They were coming from the walls, from the floor, from the very air around her. The candle flickered and went out. Jennifer screamed as the door behind her flew open, and the shadowy figure loomed over her once more, his cold hand reaching out to touch her. The room spun, and the last thing she saw was his hollow, lifeless eyes staring into hers before everything went black. When the townsfolk found Jennifer's car still parked outside Blackwater Manor days later, they knew something had gone terribly wrong. The police searched the house, but there was no sign of her. Only her laptop, still open on the desk in the study, with the final sentence of her unfinished novel typed across the screen. "He is here, and he will never let me leave." Blackwater Manor stood silent once more, waiting for its next victim. And the shadow in the mirror? It was still there, watching, waiting, forever trapped in the house that fed on fear and despair. The disappearance of Jennifer sent shockwaves through the small town. Some speculated she had simply run off, driven mad by her own obsession with horror. But those who had grown up near Blackwater Manor knew months passed, and the mystery of Jennifer's disappearance faded into the background of everyday life. That is, until Mark, her younger brother, arrived in town. He was determined to find out what had happened to his sister. Unconvinced by the official reports, Mark believed that the answers were brief. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the cliffs, Mark stood at the gates of the mansion. It was exactly as Jennifer had described in her emails to him, the decaying grandeur. Armed with only a flashlight and a bag containing a few essentials, Mark pushed open the gates and made his way toward the front door. The wind howled, much like it had the night Jennifer had arrived, and the air was thick with the smell of rain. As he stepped inside the mansion, the door groaned shut behind him. The house felt alive, like it was watching him, waiting for him to make the first move. Mark's heart raced, but he steeled himself. He had to stay focused. Moving through the house, he retraced the steps Jennifer might have taken, her last emails guiding him. He passed by the grand mirror, which now stood covered in a thick layer of grime. He paused, staring into its depths, and for a moment he thought he saw a shadow shift within the reflection. But there was no time for hesitation. He moved onward, the silence of the house broken only by his cautious footsteps. The study was just as she had described, papers scattered on the desk, the remnants of a fire in the hearth, and the faint scent of old wood and dust hanging in the air. Mark set his bag down and pulled out Jennifer's laptop, which the police had returned to him after their investigation. He powered it on, and the screen flickered to life. To his shock, the unfinished sentence was still there. "He is here, and he will never let me leave." His blood ran cold as he read those words. He could almost feel her fear, the terror she must have experienced in those final moments. But Mark wasn't ready to give up. He scoured the files on her computer, hoping to find some clue, some hint as to what had happened that night. But there was nothing out of the ordinary, no strange files, no hidden documents, until he noticed a folder titled Blackwater buried deep within her documents. Inside were notes Jennifer had taken during her brief stay. They detailed the strange noises she had heard, the rocking chair, the figure in the mirror. But what stood out most were her final notes, written the day before she disappeared. "The house is alive. I can feel it watching me. The figure in the mirror, it's not just a ghost. It's something far worse. It's waiting, and I'm afraid I won't be able to leave. If anyone finds this, don't come looking for me. The house won't let me go." Mark's breath caught in his throat. As he read those final words, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. He looked up from the screen, and his eyes fell upon the rocking chair in the corner. It was moving, slowly, back and forth. Mark's pulse quickened, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. Something was sitting in that chair, a shadowy figure that hadn't been there moments before. It stared at him with hollow eyes, much like the ones Jennifer had described, its bony fingers clutching the arms of the chair. Mark stood frozen in place as the figure rose from the chair, its twisted smile spreading across its face. He stumbled backward, knocking over the desk in his panic. The figure advanced, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring the fear radiating from him. Just as Jennifer had, Mark fled the study, his flashlight flickering as he raced through the darkened halls. But the house had changed. It was no longer the same as when he had entered. The walls seemed to shift, the doors leading him in circles, trapping him within its endless maze. The whispers began, soft at first, but growing louder with each step he took. They spoke of despair, of being trapped, of never leaving. The walls seemed to pulse with life, as though the house itself was breathing. Mark's chest tightened as panic set in. He sprinted toward the staircase, hoping to find his way out. But just as he reached the top of the stairs, the figure from the mirror appeared at the bottom, blocking his escape. Its hollow eyes glinted in the darkness as it slowly ascended the steps, each movement deliberate, unhurried. Desperate, Mark turned and ran in the opposite direction, ducking into one of the bedrooms. He slammed the door shut behind him, barricading it with a chair. His heart pounded in his chest as the doorknob began to rattle. The figure was outside, its cold breath seeping through the cracks in the door. Mark knew he had only one option left. He pulled out his phone, desperately searching for a signal, but the house seemed to swallow the connection whole. No calls, no messages would go through. Then he remembered Jennifer's last email. She had written something about the basement, something about a hidden passageway that might hold the key to escaping. With no other choice, Mark bolted from the room, sprinting down the hallway, the figure close behind him. The house seemed to shift and twist as he ran, but he finally found the door to the basement. He descended the narrow staircase, his flashlight flickering as the darkness pressed in around him. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, and the smell of dampness and decay was overwhelming. At the far end of the room, he saw the stone door Jennifer had written about in her notes. It was covered in strange symbols, worn with age, but it seemed to beckon him forward. Mark hesitated, but the figure was closing in. With trembling hands, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room beyond was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was vast, a cavern beneath the mansion, and in the center stood an altar made of black stone. Surrounding the altar were bones, thousands of them, piled high in grotesque mounds. The air was thick with a sense of malevolence. As Mark approached the altar, he saw it, the same figure that had haunted Jennifer. It stood before the altar, waiting. This time, it did not advance. Instead, it spoke, its voice a chilling whisper that echoed through the cavern. You have come to join her, as all must in time. The house is hungry. It feeds on your fear, on your despair, and now it will never let you leave. Mark's scream echoed through the halls of Blackwater Manor, but it was swallowed by the darkness. Outside, the storm raged on, and the house stood silent once more, waiting for its next victim. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as the figure's chilling voice echoed through the cavern. He felt the weight of despair bearing down on him, the very walls of Blackwater Manor seeming to close in. But something inside him stirred, a fierce, burning will to survive. He wouldn't let the house claim him. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Mark stepped closer to the altar. The figure remained still, its hollow eyes watching him with a twisted smile. The air around him grew colder, the shadows pressing in tighter, but Mark forced himself to stay focused. In Jennifer's notes, there had been one final, cryptic sentence. The house can be tricked. It feeds on fear, but the brave can escape. Mark didn't fully understand what she had meant, but he realized now that the house thrived on fear and despair. If he could resist the terror, if he could face it head on, perhaps he could break free. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the panic surging through him. He closed his eyes, focusing on memories of Jennifer, her smile, her laughter, the bond they had shared. She had come here seeking something dark, but he knew she hadn't wanted this fate. She would want him to fight. Opening his eyes, Mark stared directly at the figure in front of him. Its twisted smile faltered slightly, as if sensing his newfound determination. The whispers in the air grew louder, trying to drown out his thoughts, but Mark remained resolute. "You won't take me," he said, his voice steady, "and you won't keep her." The figure hissed, stepping toward him, but Mark didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out something he had almost forgotten, a small silver pendant that had belonged to their mother, something Jennifer had always carried with her. It was a simple thing, but it held deep meaning for both of them. Mark held the pendant up, and the figure recoiled slightly, as though repelled by the warmth of the memories it represented. The shadows around him flickered, their grip loosening. "This is her," Mark said, his voice growing stronger. "This is who she was, not a victim of this house, not your prisoner." The figure let out a guttural scream, and the entire cavern trembled. The bones began to rattle, and the shadows swirled violently. But Mark stood his ground, holding the pendant tightly in his hand. Suddenly, there was a shift in the air. The oppressive weight that had filled the room began to lift. The shadows receded, pulling back from Mark, as if something inside the house had lost its power. The figure's form wavered, becoming less distinct, its features melting into the darkness. And then, with one final, ear-splitting scream, the figure disintegrated, vanishing into the air like smoke. The cavern fell silent, and the oppressive cold lifted. Mark stood there, his heart racing, his body trembling from the adrenaline. For a moment, he couldn't believe it was over. But as he looked around, the bones that had littered the floor were gone, and the altar, once foreboding, now seemed like nothing more than a pile of old stone. He turned and ran back up the stairs, his feet light as he moved through the now familiar halls of the mansion. The house, though still dark and decaying, no longer felt alive with malice. The walls didn't pulse, the whispers had vanished, and the air was no longer suffocating. It was just an old house, haunted by nothing more than the memories of those who had come before. Mark reached the front door, and for the first time it opened easily under his touch. The storm outside had passed, leaving the sky clear and the air fresh. As he stepped out into the early morning light, he could feel a sense of freedom wash over him. He looked back at Blackwater Manor one last time, the towering structure now appearing like nothing more than an empty shell. He knew that whatever dark force had once ruled within its walls was gone, defeated not by strength but by hope and courage. As Mark walked back toward his car, he felt something warm in his pocket. He pulled out Jennifer's pendant, and for a moment he could almost feel her presence beside him, a quiet assurance that she too was free. He smiled, tears welling in his eyes, not from sadness but from relief. He had come to Blackwater Manor seeking answers, and though he had faced horrors beyond imagination, he had also found something more important: closure and the strength to move forward. As he drove away, the sun rose higher in the sky, casting the cliffs and the manor in golden light. Blackwater Manor, once a place of terror and despair, now stood silent and still, its darkness finally vanquished. And for the first time in years, both Jennifer and Mark were at peace.